The smallest act of kindness can quietly rewrite a future that money never could. At exactly 11:47 on a cool Thursday night, Ethan Brooks heard the low rumble of engines approaching his modest farmhouse outside Ashford, Montana. He looked up from a kitchen table where unpaid utility bills sat beside Emily's neatly finished math homework. Through the front window, long beams of white headlights slowly swept across the gravel driveway until a line of elegant black sport utility vehicles came to a gentle stop beneath the old oak tree that had shaded the property for decades. Ethan frowned with quiet confusion. Visitors never arrived this late, and certainly not in vehicles that looked more at home outside a luxury hotel than a mechanic's small country house. Emily looked up from the sofa, clutching the paperback novel she had been reading. "Dad, are they lost?" she whispered. Ethan offered a reassuring smile before standing and pulling on his worn brown work jacket. Only one way to find out. He stepped onto the wooden porch as the cool Montana breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh earth across the fields. One vehicle door opened softly. A young woman stepped into the porch light with calm confidence instead of hesitation. She wore a tailored navy coat over simple business attire, and although nothing about her appearance seemed flashy, there was an unmistakable grace in the way she carried herself. Her blonde hair moved gently in the evening wind, and her composed expression suggested someone accustomed to making difficult decisions without raising her voice. She slowly climbed the porch steps before stopping several feet away, giving Ethan the respectful distance of a stranger. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely familiar, as though both understood that whatever happened next would matter long after the night ended. Finally, the woman smiled gently. "Are you Ethan Brooks?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She took a slow breath before quietly saying the words that instantly erased every ordinary thought from his mind. "You fixed my grandmother's car this afternoon." Ethan searched her face, trying to remember. Then he pictured an older blue Buick stranded beside a county road. It had lifted while an elderly woman stood patiently waiting beside it beneath the afternoon sun. He remembered replacing a damaged radiator hose, checking the coolant, refusing payment, and sending her safely home with nothing more than a smile and a reminder to drive carefully. He had never asked her last name. He had never expected to see anyone connected to her again. "Is she all right?" Ethan asked immediately, genuine concern filling his voice before curiosity could. The young woman smiled more warmly, clearly surprised that his first question was about her grandmother instead of the expensive vehicles filling his driveway. "She is perfectly fine," she replied. "In fact, she insisted I come here tonight." Emily quietly opened the front door and peeked outside. The woman noticed her and offered a kind smile. "You must be Emily." Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "How do you know my daughter's name?" The woman glanced briefly toward the waiting vehicles before returning her attention to Ethan. "Because my grandmother could not stop talking about the man who repaired her car, refused every dollar she offered, and told her that if someone ever had the chance to help her little girl someday, that would be more than enough payment." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, almost embarrassed that such an ordinary decision had become the reason someone had driven all the way to his home after midnight. The woman extended her hand. "My name is Claire Kensington," she said softly, "and I owe you far more than the cost of repairing a car." Claire remained standing on the porch for a quiet moment before reaching into her coat pocket and carefully unfolding a small piece of paper. It was not a business card or a legal document. It was a handwritten note in shaky cursive, folded several times from being opened again and again throughout the evening. She smiled softly before handing it to Ethan. "My grandmother asked me to give this to you before I said anything else." Ethan accepted the paper with both hands and slowly unfolded it beneath the warm porch light. The short message simply read, "Kindness always finds its way home." He looked up with a puzzled expression, and Claire gently nodded. She wrote that after she arrived home safely. Seeing Ethan's confusion, Claire quietly continued, "There is something you should know about this afternoon." Her words carried both gratitude and quiet emotion as the memory returned. Earlier that day, Margaret Kensington had decided to drive alone through the countryside, simply to revisit the roads where she and her late husband had spent countless Sunday afternoons decades earlier. She had insisted on leaving behind the driver, the security staff, and every comfort that normally surrounded her family. She wanted one ordinary day. Nearly 30 miles outside town, a warning light appeared on the dashboard of her old blue Buick before steam slowly rose from beneath the hood. She carefully pulled onto the shoulder of the county road and waited, unsure what to do because her cell phone had no signal. Dozens of vehicles passed without stopping. Some drivers waved apologetically. Others never looked in her direction. Nearly 40 minutes later, Ethan's aging pickup truck approached from the opposite lane after he had finished repairing a rancher's tractor. Without hesitation, he pulled over, climbed out, and walked toward the stranded car with the relaxed confidence of someone who had solved thousands of mechanical problems before. "Looks like you could use a hand," he had said with an easy smile. Margaret apologized for taking his time and admitted she probably could not afford a large repair if the engine had failed. Ethan quietly lifted the hood, inspected every hose and connection, then smiled with relief after finding a cracked radiator hose that had finally given way. He drove 10 miles back to his small garage, collected the replacement part from his own inventory, returned to the roadside, installed it, refilled the cooling system, checked every connection twice, and waited patiently until the engine reached normal operating temperature. Margaret repeatedly asked how much she owed him. Ethan only smiled and wiped his hands on an old shop towel. "Nothing today," he answered. "Just promise me you will make it home safely." She insisted that honest work deserved honest payment, but Ethan gently shook his head. "I have a little girl waiting for me at home. If someone ever sees her in trouble years from now, I hope they stop because helping people is simply the right thing to do. That would be worth far more than anything you could pay me." Margaret never forgot those words. When she arrived home, she immediately told Claire everything that had happened. She described the mechanic who never asked who she was, never looked for recognition, and never expected a reward. Claire listened quietly for nearly an hour, realizing she had spent years surrounded by successful people, yet had rarely met someone whose character felt richer than his circumstances. Standing once again on Ethan's porch beneath the quiet Montana sky, she finally spoke the truth she had carried with her all evening. "My grandmother believes you repaired her car," Claire said gently. "But I think you repaired something inside me before we had ever even met." For several quiet moments, neither Ethan Brooks nor Claire Kensington spoke. The cool Montana night seemed to soften every sound except the distant chorus of crickets drifting across the open fields. Ethan carefully folded Margaret's handwritten note and slipped it into the pocket of his work jacket, as though it were something far more valuable than paper. He looked toward Claire with genuine humility. "I only fixed a radiator hose," he said quietly. Claire smiled with gentle understanding. "That is what you believe you fixed." Ethan glanced toward Emily, who stood just inside the doorway, watching the conversation with curious eyes. "Emily, it is getting late," he said kindly. "Why don't you head upstairs? I will be in soon." Emily nodded politely before smiling at Claire. "Good night." "Good night, Emily," Claire replied warmly. As the front door closed, the evening became even quieter. Claire looked around the modest farmhouse, the weathered porch swing, the neatly stacked firewood, and the old pickup truck parked beside the garage. Nothing about the property reflected wealth, yet everything reflected care. "My grandmother told me something else," Claire continued. "She said you never asked who she was." Ethan shrugged gently. "She looked like someone who needed help." That was enough. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. "Most people who meet my family recognize our last name immediately. They usually see opportunity before they see a person." Ethan gave a small smile. "I never even asked her last name." Claire laughed softly, not because anything was amusing, but because she realized how unusual that answer had become in her world. "Exactly." She paused before continuing. "When she came home this afternoon, she described every detail. She remembered how carefully you checked the engine twice before telling her it was safe to drive. She remembered that you waited until the temperature gauge stayed steady before closing the hood. She remembered that you refused payment even after she insisted several times. She said you treated her like she reminded you of someone you loved. Ethan rested his hands on the porch railing and looked out across the dark fields. She reminded me of my mother, he admitted quietly. She passed away a few years before Emily was born. If my mother had ever been stranded somewhere, I would have prayed that somebody would stop. Claire felt the weight of those words settle into the silence between them. She had attended leadership seminars, international conferences, and meetings with some of the wealthiest people in America. Yet none of those conversations had ever explained kindness as simply or as honestly as the man standing before her. She finally asked the question that had been on her mind since leaving her grandmother's house. "May I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Claire met his eyes. "Has anyone ever done something like that for you?" Ethan thought for a long moment before answering. "Not always. But enough people helped me after my wife passed away that I promised myself I would never let hardship become an excuse to stop caring about someone else." Claire quietly absorbed every word. She realized that compassion had not appeared in Ethan's life because everything had gone well. It had been forged through loss, responsibility, and daily choices that no one applauded. Looking toward the line of waiting vehicles at the end of the driveway, she took a slow breath before saying, "Tomorrow morning, I have a meeting that may affect thousands of families. Tonight, I think I finally understand what leadership is supposed to look like." Ethan smiled modestly and shook his head. "I am just a mechanic." Claire returned the smile with quiet certainty. "No, Mr. Brooks, you are something much harder to find than that, and tomorrow I intend to prove that I was paying attention." The conversation lingered in Ethan Brooks's thoughts long after the last sport utility vehicle disappeared into the darkness beyond his gravel driveway. Before going inside, he looked once more across the quiet fields stretching beneath the Montana stars, wondering why a stranger's gratitude felt so much heavier than any payment he had ever refused. The next morning arrived with the familiar rhythm he trusted more than uncertainty. Before sunrise, he unlocked Carter Auto Repair, raised the weather garage door, switched on the fluorescent lights, and welcomed another ordinary day filled with oil changes, worn brake pads, and hardworking neighbors who depended on his steady hands. To Ethan, there was comfort in routine because routine left little room for regret. Hundreds of miles away, inside the top floor of Kensington Industries headquarters, Claire Kensington stepped out of the executive elevator carrying only a leather portfolio and a handwritten note her grandmother had insisted she keep. The polished marble floors reflected the morning light pouring through enormous windows overlooking the city skyline. Employees greeted her respectfully as she walked toward the executive conference room, yet she noticed something she had ignored for years. Nearly every conversation focused on numbers, forecasts, acquisitions, or quarterly performance. Nobody spoke about people until those people appeared as statistics on screen. As the board meeting began, financial reports covered the conference table. Richard Coleman adjusted his glasses before presenting the first agenda item. "The Ashford manufacturing facility continues to underperform," he said confidently. "Closing the location would improve operating efficiency and increase shareholder value." Several directors nodded while reviewing the projected savings displayed across the presentation screens. Claire remained silent for a moment, studying photographs of the very town where Ethan quietly repaired cars every day without expecting recognition. Richard continued, "The transition package has already been drafted. Nearly 800 employees would be affected, but long-term profitability clearly supports this recommendation." Claire slowly closed the report in front of her. "How many of those 800 people have you actually met?" she asked calmly. The room fell unexpectedly quiet. Richard hesitated before answering. "That is not relevant to the financial analysis." Claire folded her hands. "Perhaps that is exactly the problem." Around the conference table, puzzled expressions replaced confident ones. Claire continued speaking with the same calm voice Ethan had heard the previous evening. "Yesterday, I met someone who repairs what others are ready to replace. He did not ask whether helping someone would increase his income. He simply saw value where everyone else might have seen inconvenience." Richard leaned back in his chair. "With respect, Claire, We are discussing a manufacturing plant, not a roadside repair. Claire looked directly at him. Leadership begins with the same question in both situations. Do we discard something because it has become difficult, or do we invest the effort required to restore what still has value? The room remained silent. Several directors exchanged thoughtful glances, while others lowered their eyes toward the financial reports. Claire finally stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the city below. I am postponing today's vote for 48 hours, she announced. I want a complete modernization proposal, workforce retraining options, and community impact projections before anyone decides the future of 800 families. Richard opened his mouth to object, but Claire gently raised one hand. We owe them more than a spreadsheet. Hundreds of miles away, completely unaware that his quiet act of kindness had become part of a conversation inside one of America's largest corporations. Ethan tightened the final bolt on an old ranch truck, smiled at his customer, and simply said the words he repeated every day. You should be good to go now. Drive safely. 48 hours passed more quickly than either Ethan Brooks or Claire Kensington expected, yet they experienced those 2 days in completely different worlds. Ethan spent every hour beneath the familiar roof of Carter Auto Repair, replacing worn brake pads, repairing leaking water pumps, and patiently explaining mechanical problems to customers who trusted his honesty more than any advertisement. Claire spent those same hours reviewing engineering reports, economic forecasts, workforce analyses, and modernization proposals that stretched across hundreds of pages. Every document described costs, timelines, and projected returns, but none of them answered the one question that continued echoing in her mind after leaving Ethan's porch. What still has value if someone is willing to repair it instead of replacing it? Early Friday afternoon, another black sport utility vehicle quietly pulled into the gravel parking lot outside the garage. This time there was only one vehicle, no convoy, no unnecessary attention. Claire stepped out wearing a simple light blue blouse beneath a navy jacket instead of formal executive attire. Ethan looked up from beneath the hood of an aging pickup truck and smiled with pleasant surprise. You found the place again, he said. Claire smiled back. I hoped you would not mind another visit. Ethan closed the hood, removed his work gloves, and washed the grease from his hands before joining her outside. Emily waved politely from inside the office before returning to her school assignment. Claire noticed the familiar rhythm immediately. Nothing about Ethan's life had changed after learning who she was. Customers still came first. Work still came before conversation. She admired that more than she expected. Ethan carried 2 steaming paper cups from the small coffee machine inside the office and handed one to Claire before they sat on a weathered wooden bench, beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree beside the garage. For a few peaceful minutes, they simply watched traffic move along the quiet highway. Finally, Claire broke the silence. I postponed the vote. Ethan looked at her curiously. The vote? Claire nodded. Whether to close one of our manufacturing plants. Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. Some people believe closing it is the smartest financial decision, she continued. Others believe keeping it open is too expensive. Ethan slowly stirred his coffee before answering. Sometimes the cheapest solution today becomes the most expensive mistake tomorrow. Claire smiled faintly. That sounds like something you learned fixing cars. Ethan nodded. My father taught me almost everything I know in this garage. He looked toward the rows of tools hanging neatly on the wall before continuing. Whenever I wanted to replace a part too quickly, he would stop me and say, Son, never throw away something that still has honest life left inside it. Repair it first. Understand it first. Respect it first. Claire repeated the words quietly to herself. Repair it first. Understand it first. Respect it first. Ethan smiled. He was not only talking about engines. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass across the parking lot, while neither of them spoke for several moments. Claire realized that the answer she had spent days searching for inside conference rooms had been waiting all along on a simple wooden bench beside a small-town garage. She looked toward Ethan with sincere gratitude. You probably do not realize it, she said softly, but every conversation with you changes the way I lead." Ethan chuckled modestly and shook his head. "I'm just sharing what my father taught me." Claire stood, holding the empty coffee cup in both hands. Sometimes the greatest lessons are not taught inside universities or boardrooms. Ethan watched as she walked back toward her vehicle, then returned to the waiting pickup truck without another thought. He believed he had simply shared a cup of coffee with a grateful visitor. Claire drove away, knowing she had just found the final reason to fight for hundreds of families who had no idea their future might depend on the quiet wisdom of a mechanic who never imagined his words could reach beyond the walls of his little garage. Monday morning arrived beneath clear skies as Claire Kensington entered the executive boardroom, carrying a single folder instead of the towering stack of reports that had filled the previous meeting. Around the polished conference table, directors quietly reviewed the revised proposal, while Richard Coleman organized the financial projections one final time. The atmosphere felt heavier than before, because everyone understood that the decision made within the next hour would shape the future of hundreds of families. Claire remained calm as she looked around the room, remembering the weathered wooden bench outside Carter Auto Repair and the simple wisdom that had followed her home. Richard stood first. "The modernization proposal requires a larger investment than the original closure plan," he began confidently. "Closing the Ashford facility still provides the fastest financial return. From a purely business perspective, that remains the logical recommendation." Several directors nodded while studying the charts displayed across the large presentation screens. Claire listened without interruption before slowly standing. "Thank you, Richard," she said with quiet professionalism. "Your numbers are accurate. They simply do not tell the whole story." She walked toward the screen and replaced the financial summary with photographs of the Ashford factory, its employees, local families, and the surrounding community. "This building is not just an expense on a balance sheet," she continued. "It represents parents paying mortgages, young people beginning careers, veterans returning to civilian life, and small businesses that survive because this factory continues operating." The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire turned another page of the presentation. Engineering specialists had confirmed that modernization would improve efficiency, reduce operating costs over time, and preserve the experienced workforce already serving the company. Workforce development experts outlined practical retraining programs instead of layoffs. Community planners demonstrated how keeping the facility open would strengthen the local economy for years rather than creating immediate hardship. Richard carefully reviewed the revised projections before speaking again. "The financial return will take longer." Claire nodded. "Yes, but lasting value usually does." She paused before adding words that no one in the room expected to hear during a corporate meeting. "A wise mechanic recently reminded me that if something still has honest life left inside it, we should repair it before deciding to replace it." Businesses deserve the same careful judgment that people do. Several directors exchanged thoughtful glances. The sentence was simple, yet it seemed to reach beyond every spreadsheet resting on the table. One by one, questions shifted away from closure costs and toward modernization opportunities. Discussion replaced argument. Solutions replaced assumptions. After nearly 2 hours of careful debate, the chairman finally called for a vote. The electronic display illuminated each decision as directors quietly cast their ballots. When the final result appeared, the room remained silent for several long seconds. The modernization proposal had been approved by a clear majority. The Ashford facility would remain open. Investment would begin immediately. Employee retraining would move forward. Hundreds of jobs would be preserved. Richard slowly removed his glasses before looking toward Claire with genuine respect. "I still believe the original proposal made financial sense," he admitted honestly. "But today you reminded us that leadership is measured by more than numbers." Claire offered a grateful smile. "The best decisions usually are." Hundreds of miles away in Montana, Ethan Brooks finished replacing the alternator on an old family sedan while Emily organized repair invoices inside the office. The grateful customer thanked him before driving safely home, and Ethan returned another wrench to its proper place without the slightest idea that the quiet lesson his father had shared many years earlier had just influenced one of the most important corporate decisions of Claire Kensington's career, changing the future of an entire community through nothing more extraordinary than honesty, humility, and the belief that what still holds value deserves the chance to be restored. 3 weeks quietly passed, and the first signs of change appeared not through headlines or grand celebrations, but through ordinary mornings that suddenly felt a little brighter across Ashford, Montana. Construction crews arrived at the manufacturing facility before sunrise, not to dismantle the buildings as many had feared, but to install new equipment, modern production systems, and upgraded safety features. Workers who had spent anxious evenings wondering whether they would lose their jobs now walked through the factory gates, carrying lunch boxes with cautious optimism instead of silent worry. Local diners filled with familiar faces once again. The hardware store welcomed contractors purchasing supplies for renovation projects. Parents spoke about school activities instead of unemployment. Hope returned one practical day at a time. Ethan Brooks noticed the difference only in small ways. More customers mentioned that business seemed steadier. A delivery driver joked that he had finally stopped updating his resume. One longtime customer smiled while paying for new brakes and casually remarked, "Looks like that factory is going to be around for a long time after all." Ethan simply nodded with genuine happiness for the town. "That is good news," he replied before handing back the truck keys. He never imagined that his own words had quietly traveled all the way into the boardroom where the decision had been made. One afternoon, Claire Kensington returned to Ashford for the first official progress inspection of the modernization project. She walked through the factory floor wearing a protective helmet and safety glasses, stopping frequently to greet employees by name. Instead of rushing through presentations, she listened carefully as technicians described improvements, supervisors discussed training programs, and longtime workers shared stories about raising their families because the factory had always provided steady employment. Richard Coleman accompanied her throughout the visit. His attitude had changed noticeably since the board meeting. As they overlooked the busy production floor from an elevated walkway, he quietly admitted, "I believed I was protecting the company by focusing only on financial efficiency." Claire looked toward the employees below before answering. "You were trying to protect the business. We simply needed to remember that people are the reason a business exists in the first place." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about the mechanic you mentioned." Claire smiled softly. "So have I." She explained how Ethan had never asked for recognition, never expected compensation beyond seeing an elderly woman reach home safely, and never realized that one ordinary conversation had reshaped the way she approached leadership. Richard remained silent for a long moment before saying, "I hope I have the opportunity to thank him someday." Claire looked out across the factory floor, where experienced workers now trained younger employees on newly installed equipment. "I think the greatest way to thank him is to keep making decisions that honor the lesson he unknowingly taught us." That same evening, Ethan closed the garage a little earlier than usual because Emily had a school music program. Together they drove across town in his aging pickup truck, laughing as she practiced the piano piece she would soon perform. Sitting in the crowded school auditorium, surrounded by neighbors and familiar faces, Ethan felt grateful for an ordinary life filled with simple blessings that could never be measured on any financial report. Across the state, Claire finished reviewing another stack of executive documents before quietly placing Margaret's handwritten note inside the top drawer of her desk. She smiled as she read the familiar words once again. "Kindness always finds its way home." Looking through the office window toward the evening skyline, she finally understood that her grandmother had been right from the very beginning. Sometimes the greatest changes begin so quietly that the world never notices the moment they start. Yet their impact continues reaching people who may never even learn the name of the person whose simple act of kindness first set everything into motion. By the time early summer arrived, the people of Ashford no longer spoke about uncertainty. They spoke about opportunity. Fresh equipment had begun operating inside the manufacturing facility, new apprentices trained alongside experienced workers, and local businesses welcomed a steady stream of customers once again. Yet if someone had asked Ethan Brooks whether his own life had changed, he would have smiled politely and answered that every day still began the same way. Before sunrise, he unlocked Carter Auto Repair, raised the garage door, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and prepared to help whoever drove into the parking lot. He never connected the renewed energy throughout the town with the quiet conversation he had shared beneath the old cottonwood tree. To him, kindness was never an investment expecting a return. It was simply the right way to live. One peaceful Saturday morning, the familiar blue Buick slowly rolled into the gravel parking lot. Ethan recognized it immediately and stepped away from the pickup truck he had been servicing. Margaret Kensington climbed out carefully with the same warm smile he remembered from the roadside weeks earlier. This time Claire Kensington stood beside her, dressed simply in a light cream sweater and dark blue slacks instead of executive business attire. There were no security vehicles waiting beyond the road, no photographers, and no business associates. They had come as family, not as executives. Emily walked out of the office carrying a box of freshly baked cookies she had helped prepare that morning. Margaret's face brightened instantly. "I was hoping I would see you again," she said kindly. Emily smiled and offered her the box. "These are for you." Margaret accepted the gift with grateful eyes before gently embracing the young girl. Claire watched the moment quietly, realizing that genuine generosity often inspired another act of generosity without anyone asking for it. Ethan approached with his familiar, easy smile. "How has the Buick been running?" he asked. Margaret laughed softly. "Perfectly. I think it is happier now than I am." Ethan chuckled. "That is always good to hear." Claire stepped forward holding a sealed envelope made from thick cream-colored paper. "This is the real reason we came today," she said. Ethan instinctively raised one hand. "If that is a check, I cannot accept it." Claire gently shook her head. "It is not money." Ethan accepted the envelope, opened it carefully, and discovered several handwritten pages signed by both Claire and Margaret. He began reading silently. Margaret thanked him for treating an elderly stranger with dignity instead of inconvenience. Claire thanked him for teaching her that leadership begins with seeing people before profits. She explained that the Ashford facility would remain open because someone had reminded her that what still carries honest value deserves the chance to be restored. She never mentioned numbers, awards, or public recognition. Instead, the final paragraph simply read, "You believed you repaired a radiator hose. In truth, you helped repair the way I see responsibility, success, and the people who trust me to lead them. That gift can never be measured." Ethan lowered the letter slowly, unable to find words for several moments. Finally, he looked toward Claire and quietly said, "I never expected any of this." Claire smiled with peaceful sincerity. "That is exactly why you deserve to know." The three adults stood together beneath the warm Montana sunshine, while Emily and Margaret laughed nearby over homemade cookies and simple conversation. Nothing about the moment appeared extraordinary to anyone driving past the small garage. Yet those few quiet minutes carried more gratitude than the grandest ceremony ever could. After folding the letter carefully and placing it inside the pocket of his work shirt, Ethan thanked them with the same humble smile he offered every customer before excusing himself to help a young couple whose family sedan had just entered the parking lot. Claire watched him walk away without hesitation, placing another stranger's needs ahead of his own, and she realized that some people do not perform kindness because the world is watching. They simply never learned any other way to live. Several months slipped quietly into autumn, and the changes that had once seemed impossible had become part of everyday life across Ashford, Montana. The modernized manufacturing facility now operated with renewed confidence. Experienced employees trained new apprentices, and local businesses welcomed steady customers whose optimism had gradually replaced uncertainty. Yet the most remarkable part of the story was that Ethan Brooks remained exactly the same man he had always been. Every morning before the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains, he unlocked Carter Auto Repair, switched on the lights, raised the garage door, and prepared another pot of fresh coffee for whoever might stop by. His hands still carried the familiar marks of honest work, and his greatest satisfaction still came from hearing an engine start smoothly after a careful repair. Emily had grown a little taller, and she continued spending afternoons at the garage after school, finishing homework before helping organize paperwork and greeting customers with the same kindness she had learned from her father. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan climbed a sturdy wooden ladder above the garage entrance carrying a handcrafted cedar sign he had spent several evenings carving by hand after Emily had gone to bed. She stood below, holding the ladder steady while looking up with proud eyes. After tightening the final screw, Ethan stepped down, brushed the sawdust from his shirt, and admired the finished sign together with his daughter. The carefully carved words read, "Integrity keeps the engine running." Emily smiled warmly. Grandpa would have loved that. Ethan looked quietly at the sign for a long moment before answering. Everything I know about fixing engines and keeping promises started with him. Just then, a familiar blue Buick slowly turned into the parking lot. Margaret Kensington stepped out first, followed by Claire Kensington, who smiled as soon as she noticed the new sign above the garage. "That sounds like more than advice for mechanics," Claire said gently. Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe that is because my father was never only talking about engines." Before anyone could continue the conversation, another customer arrived driving in. Older family sedan that produced an uneven rattling sound beneath the hood. Ethan instinctively turned toward the vehicle with the same welcoming smile he offered every stranger. "I will be right with you," he called kindly before looking back at Claire with an apologetic expression. "Duty comes first." Claire nodded without the slightest disappointment. "That is exactly why we came." Ethan walked toward the waiting customer, listened patiently to the concern, opened the hood, and immediately began another ordinary repair as though nothing else in the world required his attention. Claire quietly watched from beside the blue Buick while Margaret smiled knowingly. There were no speeches, no cameras, no awards, and no reporters waiting to celebrate the man whose quiet choices had helped change the future of an entire community. Ethan did not need recognition because he had never been working for recognition. He believed that every person deserved respect, every honest repair deserved care, and every opportunity to help another human being deserved to be accepted without hesitation. Claire looked toward the busy garage, then toward the thriving town beyond it, and finally back to the simple cedar sign hanging above the entrance. She realized that the greatest leaders are not always found inside executive offices or seated at polished conference tables. Sometimes they spend their days wearing work boots, repairing old engines, raising children with quiet dignity, and changing lives without ever realizing how far their kindness travels. As another grateful customer drove safely away beneath the wide Montana sky, Ethan simply waved, returned to his workbench, and reached for the next set of tools, unaware that the greatest legacy he would ever leave behind was never measured by wealth or recognition, but by the countless hearts quietly repaired along the way through honesty, humility, compassion, and the unwavering belief that every person still carrying honest value deserves the chance to be restored.